You will be shocked when you learn what poverty did to Victorian families. Prepare to be amazed. We imagine the Victorian era as a time of steam engines, lavish dresses, and great inventions. We see the glamour of the Industrial Revolution, elegant gentlemen and ladies drinking tea in their drawing rooms. But what if I told you that behind this facade lay a completely different reality, built on invisible labor and broken lives? It was a world where progress cast a long, dark shadow, and millions lived in that shadow. For them, the glittering shop windows of London were as distant as the moon. Their story is not one of invention, but one of survival. Women locked in a cage of social norms and economic hopelessness were particularly vulnerable in this system. Their lives were a daily struggle, where every shilling earned and every piece of bread was a small victory. Watch the video to the end to find out how a routine trip to the pawn shop turned into a weekly drama for Victorian women, and why their wedding rings rarely stayed on their fingers. What I am about to show you was a hidden truth that everyone kept quiet about. For millions of poor Victorian families, the week did not begin on Monday, but on Black Monday. It was on this day that the woman, as the family's financial manager, gathered the most valuable items and took them to the pawn shop to get money for food and coal until Saturday's payday. It was a humiliating but vital ritual that kept the family afloat. Pawn shops were not just businesses, but an integral part of the survival economy. Their signs with 3 gold balls were as familiar a feature of the cityscape as factory chimneys. The woman was not just carrying things, she was carrying symbols of her life. Her husband's Sunday suit, without which he would not be allowed into a decent place, was the first thing to be pawned. Next came shoes, bed linen, and even tools that deprived the man of the opportunity to earn extra money. The most difficult thing from a moral point of view was pawning the wedding ring. This symbol of marriage and stability often spent most of the week at the pawn shop. Women hid their left hands under their shawls to conceal their desperate situation from their neighbors and maintain the appearance of decency. The moneylender was one of the key figures in the lives of the poor. He knew all their secrets. He saw the same family pawning the same items week after week. From the condition of these items, he could judge how desperate their situation was. On Saturday evening, when the husband brought home his meager salary, the reverse ritual took place. The woman rushed to the pawn shop to redeem the most necessary items, first and foremost Sunday clothes. If there was not enough money, she had to choose what was more important, underwear or shoes. This weekly migration of items from home to the pawn shop and back was a vicious circle. The interest charged by the moneylender ate up a significant portion of the already meager budget. The family constantly lived in debt, with no way to save even a penny. For the woman, it was a constant headache and a heavy responsibility. It was she who had to decide what to sacrifice that week. A mistake in her calculations could mean that the family would go without dinner or freeze in an unheated room. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how such a system affected the family's sense of dignity and stability? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what life was really like for women in the Victorian era? Victorian society promoted the cult of the angel in the house. The ideal woman was supposed to be meek, submissive, and completely devoted to creating a cozy home for her husband. This image was actively promoted in books, magazines, and sermons. The home was declared a woman's sphere, a refuge from the cruel world of industry and commerce. Women were its guardians, responsible for the moral and spiritual climate of the family. For middle and upper-class women, this ideal was achievable, although it turned them into gilded birds in a cage. They had servants who did all the dirty work. Their main task was to look beautiful, raise their children, and entertain their husbands' guests. But for a poor woman, this ideal was not only unattainable, it was a cruel mockery. Her home was not a refuge, but a place of round-the-clock, exhausting labor. She could not be an angel because she had to be a drudge. All the housework fell on her shoulders, and she had to do it without the slightest convenience. Washing clothes was a real torture. Water had to be carried in buckets from the nearest tap, heated on the fire, and then washed by hand for hours in a basin with caustic soap. Cooking was also a difficult process. Food was prepared over an open fire or on a coal stove, which smoked and filled the room with fumes. Simple dishes such as oatmeal or potato soup required constant attention. Cleaning in overcrowded apartment buildings was a never-ending and thankless task. Dust and soot from factory chimneys penetrated everywhere. Women constantly struggled with dirt, trying to maintain at least the appearance of cleanliness in their cramped dwellings. What aspect of Victorian women's lives do you think was the most difficult? Physical labor or the moral pressure of society? But even the home was not the only place where she performed hard labor. Are you ready to learn how the living room was turned into a workshop and the bedroom into a warehouse for finished products? I will reveal the best-kept secret of Victorian industry. Many of the beautiful things that adorn the windows of London shops were not made in large factories. They were created in tiny dark rooms in poor neighborhoods as part of the so-called piecework system. This system allowed entrepreneurs to avoid the costs of maintaining factories and hiring workers. They simply distributed raw materials to women who worked from home for pennies. It was an invisible army of home workers who produced a significant portion of consumer goods. One of the most common types of such work was sewing. Women sewed shirts, trousers, dresses, and underwear. An intermediary brought them cut pieces of fabric and, after a few days, picked up the finished products, paying mere pennies for each item. The working day of such a seamstress could last 16-18 hours. She sat hunched over by the light of a kerosene lamp, performing thousands of monotonous movements. She often had to involve the whole family in the work in order to meet the quote on time. Another common sweatshop craft was the manufacture of matchboxes. This was considered one of the lowest paid and most harmful jobs. Women and their families had to glue thousands of cardboard boxes, working with toxic glue in unventilated rooms. The pay was so low that in order to earn a few pennies, they had to work all day without a break. The house was turned into a mini factory. The only room where the family ate and slept was littered with materials and finished products. This system was particularly insidious because it blurred the line between work and personal life. There was no fixed working day or days off. The work was always there in your home, constantly reminding you of itself. Thus, the home, which ideally should have been a refuge, in practice became a prison and a place of exploitation for many women. It became a workshop where cheap goods were produced at the expense of their own health and time. The glamour of Victorian commerce was paid for by this quiet and invisible drudgery. What if I showed you a time machine and transported you to Victorian London? The first thing you would notice is the lack of space. Housing was a source of constant stress and humiliation for poor families. Most of them lived in rented rooms in huge overcrowded apartment buildings known as tenements. The owners of these buildings were often ruthless businessmen who squeezed maximum profit out of their property. They divided large apartments into tiny rooms, renting each one to a separate family. 5, 7, or even 10 people could huddle in one room. The rent was exorbitantly high and consumed a quarter to half of a family's weekly earnings. Payment was due weekly, and any delay threatened immediate eviction. The rent collector was one of the most hated figures in poor neighborhoods. His arrival was a weekly nightmare for the lady of the house. If there was no money, she had to beg for a delay, listening to insults and threats. The collector did not mince words and could throw the family out onto the street with all their meager belongings in front of all the neighbors. The fear of being left on the street was a constant companion for poor families. Eviction meant not just the loss of a home, but complete disaster. They had to spend the night in workhouses or simply under a bridge, which was especially dangerous for women. The living conditions in these houses were appalling. The rooms were dark, damp, and poorly ventilated. The facilities were usually located in the courtyard and were shared by dozens of families, which led to unsanitary conditions. Women bore the entire burden of maintaining order in these unbearable conditions. They struggled with dampness, which led to mold, and with insects, which were permanent residents of these dwellings. It was practically impossible to create comfort in such an environment. What was the greatest fear of a Victorian housewife? In the next chapter, we will talk about something even more frightening than losing the roof over one's head. Are you ready to learn what the daily diet of a poor family looked like? Bread was the staple of a poor Victorian family's diet. It was the cheapest and most accessible food that could quickly satisfy hunger. However, the quality of this bread was often very poor. Chalk, alum, and even sawdust were mixed into the flour to increase its weight. The second most important food was potatoes. They were boiled, baked, or fried, and served as a versatile side dish and main course. A poor potato harvest, as happened in Ireland, could lead to a real humanitarian disaster. Meat was a very rare guest on the tables of the poor. It was usually eaten only on Sundays, and even then in very small quantities. It could be a small piece of bacon or cheap offal bought at the market at the end of the day. Tea was an essential part of the diet and was drunk several times a day. It was cheap, warming, and created the illusion of fullness. However, tea for the poor was often of poor quality and sometimes even fake. It was mixed with dried leaves from other plants. Sugar was a luxury, but they tried to add it to tea to get at least a few calories. Sweet tea with a piece of bread was often the only breakfast or dinner for the whole family. It was a quick and cheap source of energy needed for hard physical labor. Vegetables and fruits were practically unavailable. They were considered an expensive delicacy and were rarely purchased. Because of this, the diet was extremely unbalanced and lacked essential vitamins. As the head of the household, the woman was responsible for distributing food. She gave the best pieces to her husband as the main breadwinner and often remained half-starved herself. Her task was to stretch the meager supplies for the whole week, showing remarkable ingenuity. Buying food was an art in itself. Women went to the markets late in the evening when traders were willing to lower the prices of their remaining goods. They knew how to choose the cheapest, albeit not the freshest products. Constant malnutrition was the norm. Hunger was a familiar companion to millions of people living in the richest empire in the world. It affected their health, making them weak and susceptible to any ailment. Despite the meager diet, they tried to make Sunday lunch special. Even the most modest piece of meat baked with potatoes became a real celebration. It was one of the few family traditions that kept their spirits up. Ready for the shocking truth about the social norms of the past? In Victorian society, obsessed with class differences, respectability was everything. Even for the poorest families, maintaining the appearance of decency was a matter of survival and self-respect. The main marker of respectability was cleanliness. Clean clothes, a washed doorstep, and a neatly made bed could say more about a family than any words. Dirt was associated with moral decline, so women went to incredible lengths to maintain cleanliness. Laundry was a weekly ritual that demonstrated the status of the housewife. Women hung their laundry on clotheslines in their yards, and neighbors evaluated its whiteness. Gray, poorly washed laundry was a subject of gossip and condemnation. Going to church on Sundays was another way to demonstrate respectability. Families would put on their best Sunday clothes which had been stored in a chest or hung in a pawn shop all week. It was important to look dignified, even if you didn't have a penny in your pocket. Women were the main guardians of family honor. Their behavior, appearance, and manners were constantly under the scrutiny of their neighbors. Any misstep, whether it was laughing too loudly or talking to a strange man, could ruin their reputation forever. For a woman, losing her reputation was tantamount to social ruin. She would no longer be respected, her neighbors would stop talking to her, and it would become impossible to find a decent job. Therefore, women lived in constant fear of making a mistake. This cult of respectability created enormous psychological stress. Poor families had to spend their meager resources not only on food and housing, but also on maintaining their appearance. Sometimes buying a new apron was more important than buying an extra loaf of bread. Why did Victorian society value appearances so much? But what was hidden behind these facades in the legal field? In the next chapter, we will learn why a married woman was practically invisible to the law. In the eyes of Victorian law, a married woman practically did not exist as an individual. From the moment she entered into marriage, she fell under the legal guardianship of her husband, known as coverture. Her legal capacity was completely absorbed by that of her spouse. This meant that everything a woman owned before marriage automatically became her husband's property. Any inheritance she might receive also passed into his complete control. She had no right to own property in her own name. All the money a married woman earned belonged to her husband by law. He could demand that her employer pay her salary directly to him. Women worked on an equal footing with men, but had no right to dispose of the fruits of their labor. She could not enter into contracts or assume debt obligations without her husband's consent. In fact, she could not conduct any business on her own behalf. In the world of business and finance, she was completely powerless. Her husband had almost complete control over her life. He decided where they would live, how she would dress, and with whom she would associate. The law gave him the right to moderate corporal punishment to maintain discipline in the family. Leaving her husband was virtually impossible. The divorce procedure was incredibly complicated, expensive, and accessible only to the wealthiest. To get a divorce, a woman had to prove not only her husband's infidelity, but also the existence of other aggravating circumstances, such as abuse. Even if the divorce was successful, the woman still lost out. She had no rights to joint property. Everything remained with her husband, leaving her without any means of support. This system was based on the idea that women were too weak and irrational to manage their own affairs. It was believed that they needed the protection and guidance of men. In practice, this protection often turned into outright tyranny. If a woman from a poor family was not married or her husband could not provide for the family, she had to find work. The choice of professions was extremely limited and, as a rule, boiled down to three main areas: domestic service, factory work, and street vending. Each of these areas had its own harsh realities. Domestic service was considered the most respectable option. The girl lived in her employer's house, received food and a small salary. However, in practice, this was often a form of slavery with a 16-hour working day and no days off. A maid was completely at the mercy of her employers. She had to do any job, even the dirtiest and most humiliating ones. Her life was strictly controlled, and she had no right to personal time or relationships. Factory work was an alternative for many women, especially in industrial cities. Textile factories, match factories, and pottery workshops employed thousands of women. They were attracted by higher wages compared to domestic service and a degree of independence. However, working conditions in factories were extremely difficult. The working day lasted 12-14 hours in noisy, dirty, and dangerous workshops. Women worked with complex machinery, risking injury, and monotonous labor quickly wore down their health. Women were paid significantly less than men for doing the same work. It was believed that their earnings were only a supplement to their husband's income, not a primary source of funds. This allowed factory owners to exploit them unscrupulously. If a woman could not find work as a servant or in a factory, she was left with street vending. She could sell flowers, matches, shoelaces, or food, wandering the streets of the city in all weathers. This type of work was unstable and brought in very little income. Street vendors were constantly in the public eye, which made them vulnerable. They were harassed by the police and insulted by passers-by. This work was considered the bottom of the social ladder. Despite all the difficulties, the job gave the woman a certain degree of economic independence. Her own money, albeit small, allowed her to have at least some control over her life. This was especially important for widows or women abandoned by their husbands. Whatever path a woman chose, she faced hard and low-paid work. Society used her as cheap labor, providing neither protection nor respect in return. Her contribution to the empire's economy was enormous, but completely invisible. In the cramped quarters of poor neighborhoods, there was no such thing as privacy. Thin walls let every sound through, and shared courtyards and hallways were places of constant communication. Everyone knew everything about everyone else, which had both advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, this closeness created a powerful system of mutual assistance. Neighbors were not just people living nearby, but a kind of extended family. They were the first place people turned to for help in times of need. If a woman's loved one fell ill, a neighbor could look after the rest of the family or bring a plate of hot soup. If there wasn't enough money for bread, it was possible to borrow a few pennies until payday. This informal support network saved many from complete despair. Women shared not only food but also information with each other. They knew which shop was selling cheap vegetables today or where to find temporary work. This knowledge was vital for survival. On the other hand, the lack of personal space and constant surveillance by neighbors were a heavy burden. Every step a woman took was evaluated and discussed. Gossip was the main entertainment and a formidable weapon in the hands of society. Any deviation from the generally accepted norms immediately became public knowledge. An unfaithful wife, a bad housekeeper, or a negligent mother was subject to universal condemnation. Reputation, as we have already said, was a woman's most valuable asset. Conflicts between neighbors were common and could flare up over any trifle. A quarrel over a place on the clothesline or overly noisy behavior could escalate into a real war. In the confined space of the community, tension built up very quickly. This close-knit community life was both a lifeline and a cage. It provided support but deprived women of their freedom. It was precisely this paradox that made social survival so difficult for Victorian women. For most women born into poverty in the Victorian era, there was no real way up. Their lives were predetermined from birth. They were locked in a cycle of poverty that was passed down from generation to generation. The main barrier to a better life was a lack of education. Girls from poor families were rarely sent to school for long. It was believed that learning to read, write, and count was sufficient for running a household. Their education consisted of learning the skills necessary for their future roles as wives, mothers, and workers. From an early age, they helped their mothers around the house, looked after their younger siblings, and learned to sew or do other piecework. Their childhood was very short. Without an education, they could not aspire to skilled and well-paid jobs. Their lot was monotonous work in factories, in service, or on the streets. This ensured that they would remain in the same social class as their parents. By marrying a similarly poor worker, a woman simply moved from one form of dependence to another. She continued to struggle for survival, but now she was responsible not only for herself, but also for her new family. Her horizons did not expand in the slightest. Even if a woman was smart, talented, and ambitious, she had virtually no chance of realizing her potential. The social and economic barriers were too high. Any attempt to break out of her circle was viewed with suspicion and hostility by society. If dreams of a better life existed at all, they were very modest, saving up a little money to open a small shop or hoping that their husband would find a more stable job. That was the limit of their desires. But even these simple dreams rarely came true. This vicious circle gave rise to a sense of fatalism and hopelessness. Many simply accepted their fate as a given, not believing in the possibility of change. They lived for the moment, solving immediate problems and not looking far into the future. This was the main tragedy of Victorian poverty. It deprived people not only of money and comfort, but also of hope. It created invisible walls around entire classes, from which it was almost impossible to escape. The story of these women is not one of great achievements. It is a story of quiet, everyday heroism, resilience, and dignity in the face of unbearable circumstances. They were the invisible foundation on which the greatness of the Victorian era was built. We see that behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era lay a harsh reality in which poverty systematically destroyed families and made women's position particularly vulnerable. She was caught between social ideals she could not achieve and economic necessity that pushed her into hard labor. Their lives were a constant struggle for food, for shelter, for reputation, and for the right to simply be considered human beings. The story of these women is an important reminder that progress is never uniform, and that every great era has its dark side. Their voices rarely made it into the pages of official history, but it was their resilience and daily labor that formed the foundation on which society was built. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the hidden pages of history.